Okay, so we're on page 6 is where we left off in your outlines. If you didn't get an outline, they're right in the entryway there. And we covered pages 1 through 5 last week. If you're watching on video, those are in the description page. You can print out an outline as well as a bibliography that's now 17 pages. So even for those of you who are in here, I've added about 30 items just this last week. So if you want to keep up on that, I'm not going to be making outlines every week of all the editions, but if you want to look on that, I'm going to be adding videos and books and DVDs and so forth as we go along through this series. Because again, I'm the type of student that every time I read something and they recommend something, I get it typically. So I'm constantly adding to my own resources, and I'll be adding things that are helpful to me along the way. Okay, so we're on page 6, and what I want to do is I want to start off. The most important thing we do here at Marin Bible Church is we study the Bible. And we want to be biblical about everything, including our view of science. And when we're looking at evolution, so the first several weeks as we do this no final conflict, one of the things we're saying is that for a Christian, naturalistic evolution is not an option, because naturalistic evolution is trying to figure everything out without God in the picture. And again, for us as Christians, the foundation of everything is God. So if you take God out of the picture, you're already in trouble. You already find yourselves in a dilemma. So for the Christian, naturalistic evolution is not an option. And the good news is, I think as we study naturalistic evolution, we find that there's a lot of problems with it. So it'd be one thing if it was like, wow, this evidence for evolution is really compelling. But I think as we're going to see, we're going to go over what is the evidence for evolution. And we're going to see, I hope, that it's not compelling. There really is, even if I was not a believer, I would hope that anybody, whether believer or not, that you're after the truth and you're looking at the information, you're looking at the data, and you're comparing it with other things, and you're trying to figure out what's true. And I think that in my study of what the scientists have to say so far, as far as I've been reading, I haven't found anything compelling from naturalistic evolution that makes me stop with my jaw open and go, man alive, maybe I've got this whole thing wrong. It's really the opposite. It's, as I study evolution, I find that there's a lot of weaknesses with it. And so, but I would encourage you, wherever you're at on the spectrum of this issue, to really pursue the truth. And so what I want to do is I just want to start out in the Bible. So if you go to Genesis chapter 5, and these passages are written out in the middle of page 6, but Genesis 5, and we're going to be studying Genesis 1 through 11 in great detail during the sermon series. So I'm not going to look at Genesis 1 and 2 right now, but we're going to spend a lot of time in there. So that's why we're skipping Genesis 1 and 2. But Genesis 5, 1 to 3 says this. It says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam when God created man." Okay, so right there we see that's counter to what evolution teaches. Okay, man did not evolve, man was created. And so it says God created man. And he made them in the likeness of God, male and female, he created them. So both the male of the human species and the female of the human species were created by God. They did not evolve. And he blessed them and named them man when they were created. Okay, So again, let's also go to Psalm chapter 8, and I'm going to read the whole psalm. It's a short psalm. It's a very familiar psalm, but Psalm chapter 8. And Psalm 8, if I can get there. This is a Psalm of David, and he says, "O Lord, O our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babies and infants, you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? So that tells us he's the one who made the heavens. He's the one who set the stars in place. He's the one who set the moon before us. And then he says, what is man that you're mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him? You have made him, okay, referring to creation again, a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. All sheep and oxen and all the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. Our Lord, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. So he's praising God for the fact that he's the one who made everything we observe, including ourselves. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 42. Isaiah 42 and verses 5 through 9. Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to people on it and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord. I've called you in righteousness. I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols. Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. So again, just talking about the sovereignty of God and how he's the one who created everything in verse 5. Okay, then go to Acts. We find this teaching also in the New Testament. Acts chapter 17. Acts 17, and I want to start at verse 24. And this is Paul preaching in Athens at the Areopagus to a bunch of pagans. He says, the God who made the world, okay, and everything in it. Okay, so again, totally going against evolution. God made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him. Yet he is not actually far from any of us. So again, just a declaration of the fact that God made man. And then look at Romans. Go a few chapters over. The next book here, Romans chapter 1. And in my opinion, Romans 1 is probably the chapter that you should know better than any other for evangelism and apologetics, because it really explains where all of humanity is coming from. And let's pick it up at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from, chapter 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. So again, this tells us that it's not an intellectual thing. It's not really, I don't believe because of the evidence. What the Bible says is by their unrighteousness, they suppress the truth. In other words, they want to live in sin. Okay, so that's the bottom line issue. And then he says, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. Okay, again, creation, in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. And then 2 Peter will be the last passage we look at. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 to 6. And this is interesting because I think we really see this all around us right now. He says in verse 3 of 2 Peter 3, knowing this first of all, that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. Again, I think it's interesting. Their scoffing isn't coming from, most people will laugh us out of the building in a science department now if we say we believe in creation. And that's scoffing. But it's not because of the evidence. It's because, what does it say? Why are they doing this? Their own sinful desires. Okay? Just interesting. So the Bible's totally consistent about this. Why don't people believe in creation? Because they want to live in sin. That's what the Bible says over and over again. Okay, they will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. For they deliberately overlooked this fact. You want facts? God created. That's the fact. That the heavens existed long ago and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God, not through the process of evolution. And that by means of these, the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. Okay, so that's, of course, alluding to the flood. Okay, so what we see, of course, as Christians who basically, we get our marching orders and our authority and our starting point, our presupposition is that the Bible is true. And everybody has presuppositions. So when we're dealing with naturalistic evolution, their presupposition is there's no God. So we have to explain everything naturally. And so naturally, that's what they do. They try to explain everything naturalistically without even the possibility that there could be anything supernatural. So that's what we're up against, and that's why it's challenging and difficult to be able to deal with people who buy into naturalistic evolution, because we both have two different presuppositions. We start with God, they start with materialism. And so because our starting points are different, then we have just constant conflict. Okay, so that's why there is a conflict. And again, the reason I think that the conflict is even greater than just the presupposition intellectually is because people love their sin. People don't want to stop doing what gives them pleasure. And so the greater issue is the fact that people love sin more than they love God. And that's interesting too, because all the statistics show, as much as naturalistic evolution is the number one thing being taught, if there's a common denominator in all the public school system and in our universities, it's that everybody is teaching naturalistic evolution. But what's interesting about that is still the vast majority of people who go through the public school system and through the universities, still over 70% of the people polled every year say they believe there's a God. So it's just interesting that even though they're totally indoctrinated, but the issue is they do live as atheists. Whether they believe there's a God or not, the reality is most people live in a way that's practical atheism, as if there is no God and no judgment day. And in America, most people think they're good and they deserve heaven. You ask the average person out there, I've never killed anybody, they'll point to Charles Manson. I'm not like Charles Manson, I'm not like Hitler, and so therefore I'm good and I'm going to heaven when I die by default because I'm so good. But again, if you take God out of the picture, everything looks a lot better in terms of your own nature. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to try and get as far as we can. I'm not going to go too fast through this material. I'd rather you understand it and take it in. But I want to start looking at a few problems with evolution. And as I read, again, I've told you already, I'm not a science expert. I'm learning just like you are. And I want to be teachable and humble as I look at evidence from all the different positions and sides. But as I come up with information, I'll be sharing you some of what I think is the best information that I'm gathering as we go along in this class. And again, as questions come up, we had a few questions come up last week. I hope I answer all your questions to your satisfaction. But sometimes it's going to take us time to get to the specific questions you ask. So let's try and keep the questions at the end to the information we're looking at this morning. Okay, so first of all, did God use evolution as his method of creation? And again, we can answer this question already very quickly. When we're looking at evolution, there's what we call macroevolution, and there's what we call microevolution. And again, for last week, just as a reminder, some of these questions I think are so good to ask evolutionists. Let's look at them again, just up on page 6. You know, when you talk to an evolutionist or somebody who says they believe in evolution, ask them what they mean by evolution. And most of them, this is what I've found when I talk to evolutionists, is what they're actually describing typically is microevolution. It's not macroevolution. And Christians do believe in microevolution, change within kinds. For instance, we believe there's lots of different canines. We see a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, and we go, that's evolution. But what we mean by that is change within species. We see a cat, and we say, that cat can never come from the canine species. But in macroevolution, that's what they teach, is that everything goes down to a common, it started with a cell, and everything that we see has come about through the process of macroevolution. And we don't believe that. We think the Bible contradicts that. And we also see, as we study science, that we don't really see any genuine evidence for that. What we do see is evidence for microevolution. And so evolutionists usually, when they give examples of microevolution, and then they extrapolate from that macroevolution. And I think we need to point that out when they do that, because I think that's that's problematic. Also, another question we need to ask is, if there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing? Okay, ask somebody that this week. Go to whatever coffee shop you go to, or market, or whatever. If you're standing in line, just do it. Just ask somebody, why do you think there's something rather than nothing? They might think you're nuts, but any thinking person who thinks about that, you're going to get probably in a good conversation with them. Where did the first life come from? Ask people that. That's a great question. Doesn't there have to be pre-existing life for life to exist? Okay. What caused non-living chemicals to produce life? How do you get life from non-living chemicals? And how did non-intelligent matter produce intelligent life? So how do we go from this podium to the intellect, to consciousness? Evolutionists have to account for all those. And we can account for them very easily. This is all talked about in the Bible, very simply, very easily, no problems. But for the evolutionists, they got problems with all these things. So did God use evolution as his method of creation? Middle of the page on page 6. Under the banner of theistic evolution, so there are Christians that hold to God beginning, God creates, and then through evolution, we have everything that exists. There are Christians, I know several Christians that believe this. There's possibly people in our church that believe this. I have problems with it. And so I'm going to bring a book and show you another time I do this. It's over 1,000 pages, and it's a critique on theistic evolution. I'm going to show it to you. I just want you to know that it's very challenging reading. You really have to know something of science to be able to read all the critique from scientists on evolution. But it's like a chemist like James Tour, who as a chemist, as a world-renowned chemist, one of the top chemists in the world, who he has a problem with evolution from his study as a scientist who all he does is nanochemistry. And he says, from my study, I've got major problems with evolution. And so in that book, you have a biologist, you have a geologist, you have an astronomer, you have all these different people who that's what they do for a living. They're professional scientists, and all of them have problems with evolution. And so I want you to know, I'm not an expert in those areas. That's why I need to read those guys and see what they have to say, and see how they deal with evolution. But what I want you to know is that most Christians, the vast majority of Christians, do struggle with theistic evolution as well, although it's growing. That view is growing, and it may become the dominant position in our time, but at this point it's still the minor report of evangelical Christians. Liberal Christians, they're either evolutionists or theistic evolutionists by default. Okay, so first, what do we see about this? The biblical account of creation specifically states that God created living creatures according to their own kinds. Okay? So let's look at that. Genesis 1:24 and 25. Again, in the sermon series, we'll take our time through this, but I just want you to see verse 24 of Genesis 1, and God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds. Livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So again, I mean, you see that term kinds, I think 6 times in just 3 verses. It's like, I want you to get this point. I'm the one who does this. And so again, evolution, I think, there's no way out of this. Whether it's naturalistic evolution or theistic evolution, you've got a problem interpreting the scriptures. And so again, we're going to push this aspect as we go along. So, as confirmed, continuing in the reading there, as confirmed by science, the DNA for a fetus is not the DNA for a frog. And the DNA for a frog is not the DNA for a fish. Rather, the DNA of a fetus, frog, or fish is uniquely programmed for reproduction after its own kind. Thus, while Scripture and science allow for microevolution, that is, transitions within the kinds, they do not allow for macroevolution, amoebas evolving into areas or apes evolving into humans. Furthermore, evolution is the cruelest, most inefficient system for creation imaginable. Perhaps Nobel Prize-winning evolutionist Jacques Monod put it best. He said, quote, "The struggle for life and elimination of the weakest is a horrible process against which our whole modern ethic revolts." And he continues, "I'm surprised that a Christian," so he's talking about a theistic evolutionist, "would defend the idea that this is the process which God more or less set up in order to have evolution." Because what that takes is massive amounts of death. Okay? And so one of the main reasons I'm a creationist is I believe you have a lot of problems. I'm going to look at a lot of those problems at some point, but I believe that death is the result of sin. If you have evolution, that means that death comes before sin. And I think that's problematic throughout the scriptures. So again, if you're a scientist and your presupposition is naturalism, you're constantly bucking up against what the Bible says. You're just beating your head on this thing. And I think what's happening in our culture is a lot of Christian scientists are going, well, I'm not going to be accepted in the scientific community. I'm not going to be able to be published. I'm not going to get tenure if I go against naturalism. So they try to conform the Bible to science, and what they end up doing is they end up compromising their interpretation of the scriptures. They end up imposing a lot of unbiblical ideas into the text, and it's pretty problematic, I think, and we'll see that as we go along. Okay, another point, finally, at the bottom of the page there, theistic evolution is a contradiction in terms, like the phrase flaming snowflakes. God can no more direct an undirected process than he can create a square circle. Yet this is precisely what theistic evolution presupposes. Evolutionism is fighting for its very life. Rather than prop it up with theories such as theistic evolution, thinking people everywhere must be on the vanguard of demonstrating its demise. Okay, and again, we already saw that passage from Acts 17. So let's move on to the next question. Is it possible for a protein molecule to come into existence by chance? Okay, now if you just read that statement, what's wrong with that statement in the first place? Does anybody see what's wrong with that? What's wrong with a question? Okay, I'll give it to you then. What is chance?
Yeah.
Okay, chance is just a term we use to describe mathematical possibilities, right? Yeah, Rick.
It's the opposite of luck, or it is. Luck and chance are the opposite of statistical probability.
Okay, good. Yeah, and again, it's not. It really can't do anything, right? It's just something we describe to do what you just said: probability and statistics and data and so forth. But again, chance itself is nothing. Okay, it has no power of being in and of itself. Okay, so Spencer, go ahead and grab an outline so you can follow.
You had to bring attention to me being here.
It's okay. Well, you know, I had to get your attention somehow.
Thank you.
I think it's actually the other page. That's the bibliography, but you can take that too. Over there. There you go. So what you have is, and we're on page 7. Is it possible for a protein molecule to come into existence by chance? And evolutionary theory concerning how the first organized form of primitive life evolved hardly corresponds to reality. So first, there's not the slightest evidence for an evolutionary sequence among the unimaginably varied cells existing on our planet. Secondly, no living system can rightly be called primitive with respect to any other. Consider, for example, that life at bare minimum demands no fewer than 250 different kinds of protein molecules. Okay? And third, giving the evolutionary process every possible concession, the probability of arranging a simple protein molecule by chance is estimated to be 1 chance in 10 to the 161st. That's a 1 followed by 161 zeros. Okay? For a frame of reference, consider the fact that there are only 10 to the 80th, so that's half of that. That's a 1 followed by 80 zero atoms in the entire known universe. Okay, so boom, you're done, evolutionist. I mean, there's just no way out of it. Okay, so if in time a protein molecule were eventually formed by chance, forming a second one would be infinitely more difficult. As such, the science of statistical probability demonstrates that forming a protein molecule by random processes is not only improbable, it's impossible, and forming a cell or a chimp beyond illustration. As it says in Psalm 14:1, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Sir Fred Hoyle, one of the world's leading astronomers and mathematicians, and he was an evolutionist, by the way, said before the British Academy of Sciences, quote, "The probability of life arising by chance is the same probability as throwing a 6 on a dice 5 million consecutive times." Okay, and Rick, you're in the casino industry. You know the probability of that, right? So, yeah, you know, just... again, it takes an incredible amount of faith to believe in naturalistic evolution. Okay, how about the fossil record? Let's look at the fossil record. Historically, the most convincing evidence for evolution is the fossil record. Evolutionists claim that the fossil record displays a gradual evolution of animal and plant life from primitive forms to complex forms with transitional phases between major classes. For instance, between fish and amphibians, amphibians and reptiles, reptiles and birds, and so on. But this scenario has no support. There is no evidence that complex life forms evolved from primitive life forms because no such transitional species between any of these groups of animals have ever been found in the tons of fossil-bearing rock recovered over the past 130 years. Textbook drawings of transitional species are simply artists' conceptions of what they think such animals would look like if they did exist. All the major groups of animals are distinct from one another throughout the fossil record, and their particular characteristics are fully formed and functional when they first appear. For example, when feathers and wings first show up, they're fully formed feathers and wings. No part leg, part wing, or part scale, part feather fossils have ever been found. What use would a part leg, part wing have anyway? According to evolution, for any trait to be passed along, it must have survival value. Certainly, a part leg, part wing would have no survival value to either a reptile or a bird. In fact, it would likely be a detriment. On the other hand, the creationist model explains the absence of transitional species. The Bible teaches, as we just read in Genesis 1:4, that God created living creatures after their kind. This can be interpreted to mean that God created all the original kinds of animals with specific gene pools that contained all of the genetic potential needed for each type of animal to produce diverse varieties within its own kind. For example, the canine family probably arose from an original created kind. From the first dog, all the various wild and domestic dogs on Earth developed. But this is not evolution in the sense that modern canines evolved from some pre-dog ancestor. Rather, the original created dog kind developed through adaptation to diverse environmental conditions into the numerous forms of dogs we see today. This is the process called microevolution, which is not one species evolving from a more primitive species, but a created kind fulfilling its full genetic potential within the limits of its original gene pool. Both extinct and modern canines have always been just dogs. In the fossil record, there has never been a half dog, half cat, or half dog, half some other animal. There has always been just dogs. Natural selection within created gene pools accounts for every change seen in every kind of animal on Earth, extinct or modern. All the illustrations given by evolutionists to prove evolution are in reality no more than adaptations within specific gene pools. Science has never seen in nature or observed in a laboratory one species of animal evolve into another. When cockroaches become resistant to a pesticide, it does not represent the evolution of a new species of cockroach. Rather, it illustrates natural selection within the cockroach gene pool, allowing insects already resistant to a particular pesticide because of their existing genetic makeup to become dominant within a population of cockroaches. But the new breed of resistant cockroaches are still cockroaches. Stephen Jay Gould, who was a world-renowned evolutionist from Harvard, he said this: the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. By the way, there's a guy, oh man, his name just slipped me. I think his name just totally, Gunter, his first name's Gunter. his last name slipped me, but he's in that book, Theistic Evolution, and he's a paleontologist. And he was considered the top paleontologist on the European continent. And because of this, his study of, that's what he does for a living, is he studies bones. Okay, and he studies the fossil records of bones, dinosaur bones, and so forth. In paleontology, he came to the conclusion that evolution it just isn't true, because we don't have any transitional forms in the fossil record. And we have millions of fossils, and we have no transitions. And so because of that, he pointed to the fact that there must be an intelligent designer that begun this, and he got fired. And so he's now working at the Discovery Institute, which is the intelligent design wing with Stephen Meyer and William Dembski, that group. But Philip Johnson is considered sort of the founder of that group. But here's a guy, I think his name's Gunter Beckley, but I could be wrong. So Stephen Jay Gould could say this, who was considered the top paleontologist, but he held to his guns on evolution, even though he could say this, that it's just inference. It's just, we just got to, basically what he's saying is we got to just believe this by faith, okay? And, but Gunter Beckley, was willing to risk his job. I don't think he realized he was going to get fired, but he's sticking by his guns that, hey, in all my study of paleontology, I just don't see transitional forms. So he's willing to take a stand for that, and thus lost his job, but God provided another one in the intelligent design community. Okay, Professor Lewis T. Moore, one of the most vocal evolutionists, said this, quote, "The more one studies paleontology, that is the fossil record, the more certain one becomes that evolution is based on faith alone." End quote. So there you go. One of the most vocal evolutionists saying it's based on faith, not facts, as the textbooks will tell you. Ron Carlson, in his book, Fast Facts on False Teachings, said this. He said, "We have never observed evolution in the fossil record, and we have never observed evolution in the natural world. Evolution is a theory that exists only in the imaginations of evolutionists." I love that. I think that's great. Okay, moving on. Yes?
What's Carlson's background?
What? I'm sorry, what was that?
Ron Carlson?
Yeah.
What's his background?
He's just, he's a Christian. He's a Christian apologist.
Okay.
Yeah. He's with the Lord now. He died about 2 or 3 years ago. Okay, mutations. Let's look at mutations. A second important, so we looked at fossils and found that wanting. Then let's look at mutations. A second important argument used to support evolution focuses on mutations. And I want to just say something while it's fresh. I'll probably repeat myself, over this course, but please forgive me. But John Ashton is a scientist in Australia, and he wrote a book called 50 Scientists That Believe in Six-Day Creation. And what he did is he became a creationist because of the problem of mutations. And in his study, he was asking evolutionists in Australia, professional scientists at universities that are doing research and teaching science to students that are becoming scientists. And he said he thinks over 100 scientists about mutations. And he said, do you have any, I think this question was asked last week. He asked, do you have any positive examples where mutations go up and gain information rather than go down and lose information? And he couldn't find a single scientist out of 100 who are evolutionists to show how. So for instance, with dogs, when you breed dogs, when you go from a Great Dane to a Chihuahua, what you're doing is you're actually losing genetic information, and you can't go backwards. In other words, from that point on, anything that you're going to breed from a Chihuahua, try and breed that's different than a Chihuahua as a dog, is going to lose even more genetic information. So in other words, it's not getting better, it's devolving, not evolving. So evolution really is, naturalistic evolution really is the study of devolution. It's not ascension, it's descension. It's not life, it's decay. And this is intelligent people breeding dogs that can't do it. So it's in a lab, it's through scientists, it's through intelligence, and yet you still can't make genetic information better. You're constantly losing that. Yeah?
Just blowing my own mind here. And what if you took, like, what if you had some master geneticist that could take all the defects, like Tay-Sachs cells or whatever?
Right.
So, I mean, so why is that an argument that can be made to say that you could ferret out all the defective genes and make something better?
I think, again, though, the problem is you have intrusion from intelligence. They're saying that we've evolved, like we have intellect and intelligence from non-intellect and non-intelligent, from non-life to life. How do we do that? We can't even do that in a lab with intelligent people. So again, I just think the point is, let's not get them away with them saying that evolution is fact. Let's point out these problems that they have and say, can you explain this?
One last one.
Yes.
Yeah. People argue, and then they'll say,
Yeah.
well, that's the whole Darwin thing. It's like, so only the ones with the best genes would survive and the defective ones would go away. How do you respond to that?
I'll think about that and give you a good answer at some point. Yeah.
Questions for the end, please.
Yeah. All right, let's keep moving. All right, mutations. A second important argument used to support evolution focuses on mutations. Evolutionists argue that the mechanism by which one species evolves into another is through genetic mutations. The idea goes something like this. Through a genetic foul-up, a species of animal is born with a new trait that aids its survival. For instance, an animal is born with a deformed ear that actually allows that animal to hear an approaching predator better than others of his species. Because this characteristic is beneficial, that particular animal survives to pass on the trait to its offspring, which in turn benefits from the same trait and passes it on to their offspring. Eventually, after millions of years and countless generations, the animals with the more efficient hearing dominate the species. And what was once a deformity is now part of the genetic makeup of all the animals within the particular species. Evolutionists teach that with vast amounts of time, thousands of these tiny mutations can eventually give rise to an entirely new species of animal. Thus, accidental mutations plus long time spans plus natural selection, survival of the fittest, results in the continual emergence of new species of animals. Okay, so what's the flaw in this theory? First, in practically every known case, a mutation, this is what we were just saying, is not beneficial, but harmful to an animal and usually kills it. A deformity lessens the survival potential of an animal. It does not strengthen it. And even if there are good mutations, the tremendous number of bad mutations would overwhelm the fewer number of good ones. What one would expect to see if mutations were passed along to future generations is a tendency for a species to degenerate and eventually become extinct, not evolve upward to a new or better species. Okay? The second flaw in the mutation theory is that the time needed for a primitive animal to evolve into a higher animal through random mutational changes is mathematically impossible. The problem lies in the fact that there must be a series of both related mutations and subsequent mutations that are complementary to one another. A new trait does not evolve in one generation. For a deer to evolve greater speed requires not only that it slowly over countless generations develops more powerful legs, but that corresponding mutations in other areas of its body must also take place at the same time. To run faster, more efficient circulation, heart, lungs, and so on are needed. Creationist Dr. Gary Parker explains that the chances of getting 3 related mutations in a row is 1 in a billion trillion, 10 to the 21st power. To illustrate the odds of this, he states that the ocean isn't big enough to hold enough bacteria to make it likely for you to find a bacterium with 3 simultaneous or sequential related mutations. Moreover, the time that would be needed for enough mutations to occur to evolve, even a simple organism, is many billions of years longer than what evolutionists themselves believe the age of the Earth to be. Okay, so a similar problem exists with regard to the probability of life accidentally coming into existence from non-life through chemical processes in the Earth's alleged primordial soup. With the discovery of the genetic code, we now know that the amount of information coded in the organization of a simple living cell is so vast that its accidental formation by random processes is beyond possibility. According to Sir Fred Hoyle, an eminent mathematician and astronomer, if the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, as most evolutionists believe, the probability of a single living cell originating by random processes would be one chance in 10 to the 40,000ths. That's 10 with 40,000 zeros behind it. Okay? In other words, the probability is so small that it is not even considered as a viable option by most scientists familiar with information theory and probability studies. Today, thanks to supercomputers, it is firmly established that chance, long time spans, and mutations cannot account for the origin of life nor confirm the evolution of even a simple organism. As Hoyle puts it, quote, "The chance that higher life forms might have emerged in this way is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein," end quote. Okay, the last thing we'll look at this morning is the age of the Earth, and then we'll take questions. The age of the Earth. The third ingredient vital to the evolution recipe is an old Earth. Although the age of the Earth is not a factor in the creationist model of origins, remember, even if the Earth is 5 billion years old, it is still not old enough for even simple organisms to evolve. Time is of the utmost importance on the evolution model. Evolutionists generally agree that the age of the Earth is between 4.5 and 5 billion years old. The most common dating methods used by science to substantiate this age are one of several radiometric systems. These methods measure geologic time according to the rate of disintegration of radioactive elements. They are based on the assumption that decay processes have remained fairly stable throughout geologic history. Today, much data is available that questions the accuracy of radiometric dating systems. And there are numerous other dating methods that suggest a young Earth. In fact, over 60 chronometers date the Earth as young. In geologic term, a young Earth would be tens of thousands to hundreds of millions of years old rather than billions of years old. Dating methods that point to a geologically young Earth include the decay of the Earth's magnetic field, the accumulation of meteoritic dust on the Earth's crust, the amount of helium in the atmosphere, the influx of sediment into the oceans via rivers, and the influx of specific chemicals into the oceans. In all of these cases, if the Earth was billions of years old, the amount of decay or accumulation would be much greater than they are today. And then this final quote by Ken Ham in his Pocket Guide to the Best Evidences. He says, "In many ways, the age of the Earth is an event more foundational, is an even more, foundational issue for Christians than that of evolution. For if the Earth is only thousands of years old, as the Bible indicates, then there's not nearly enough time for evolution to have happened." Okay, so a lot of information. A lot of material there. We talked about the age of the Earth as a problem for evolution, the mutations as a problem for evolution, and the fossil record, as well as how does a protein molecule come to existence by chance. So 4 different problems for naturalistic evolution. So we got a few minutes for questions. So again, I probably won't be able to answer very many of your questions because this is not my area of expertise. That's why I'm reading so much and reading you information from people that are experts in this. It's not my area of expertise, so I'm doing the best that I can to understand it myself. Yes?
Page 7. one of the current popular ideas is that the molecules that we have to produce life simultaneously is because of aliens. What can bring me some information that counters that, because that's like this, you know, the current, this is the popular current now.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the very interesting things about comparing science with scriptures is that I guarantee you that all the science textbooks that are out there right now will be obsolete in probably 10 years. You know, the scientists are constantly backtracking on theories, coming up with new theories, and that's why there's a famous quote that I think I'm actually going to read it, and it's in the outline somewhere at some point, so I'll repeat myself, but Robert Jastrow wrote a book called God, the God of the Astronomers. And Robert Jastrow is not a Christian, but there's a line in the book that's a famous line. It's actually made him and that book famous because he's quoted so much by Christians. But he basically says that what he thinks is going to happen someday is the scientists are going to exhaust all the possibilities, all the theories that they could possibly come up with. And at some point, they get on the highest mountain, the highest ledge in the world, and there they find a band of theologians that have had the answer all along. And the point is that the Bible will never change. What it says about creation, what it says about the age of the earth, what it says about God's design for mankind and kinds and all that kind of stuff will never change. But the issue is it needs to be interpreted correctly. And so I think these guys are struggling because, again, if you start with no God in the mathematical formula, and you got to come up with this stuff scientifically without the truth of God beginning it, you're going to have, all kinds of problems. And I think that goes for any truth if your premise is false. For instance, I'm entitling our series on Genesis, Building on God's Foundations. And I think that what we see in our culture right now is because not only do we not have the foundations of God, we're building on no foundations at all. Because everything that everybody's doing is based on humanism or it's based on naturalistic evolution, whatever. So you have no foundation to build on. So the thing can't even get built up. It's crumbling before it even gets built up. And again, as long as you go away from God's design, you're in trouble. But I think it's interesting that, they keep coming up with all kinds of newfangled theories that they're incredibly far-fetched. The multi-universe theory is another one that's just incredibly far-fetched. That has, again, even if you go to the multi-universe, you still have to get, well, where did that come from?
Exactly.
You know?
Still
Yeah.
Okay, on that very point, is it the cosmic argument, or I think it was Saint Anselm in the 1100s, that kind of posed that possibility. And even in those universes, you would have to have this all-loving God.
Right.
He came up with the same picture of God in any circumstance, that there's a created universe.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and again, so whether it's the cosmological argument or the ontological argument, I don't know which one you're referring to, but the ontological argument is that we can't think of any greater being than God, therefore he must exist.
Okay.
So that's that. But again, what you're doing is you're saying philosophically that to have any kind of being, you must have an original being for that to derive from. So like we have intelligence, so there must be an intelligent being that intelligence is derived from. The cosmological argument is that anything that's caused must have something that caused it, something greater than itself to bring it about. And so we would say that God is the ultimate cause. Now, what evolutionists typically will say was, well, where did God come from? And again, that that is a misunderstanding of who God is, because God is an eternal being. So he doesn't have, since God doesn't have a cause and he just is, he can bring about any, everything else can derive from him because he has the power of being within himself. Now, again, that admittedly, that does take faith. But for me, that takes less faith than that something can come from nothing. To me, that's absolutely absurd. It's not even a possibility. So with the second law of thermodynamics, which we'll get into next week, again, most scientists are in agreement that there was a beginning. That there's a beginning of time, there's a beginning of matter, there's a beginning of space, energy, and so forth. But again, you have to say, well, where did that come from? How did that get here? Where did that come from? So again, then they go to the multiverse theory, this intelligence on other lives. But again, you still have the same problem. Okay?
Still implying an eternal cause.
Right.
You're still kind of crudely constructing a type of God.
Yeah.
By doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Chuck.
If this evolution started by chance, which, like you say, is no force, it's nothing.
Right.
The more, what to me would fly in the face of the evolutionists, how do they explain this from nothing to something, and then that something having a complementary part, like male and female,
Right.
producing all the kinds.
Right.
I mean, that would complicate everything else too, to the exact, for man, woman, and same thing with dogs and so on.
Yeah.
So how do they, that complicates it even more for
Yeah.
evolution to form both sides, male, female, which complement each other, and then produce
Right.
from that.
Right.
So the whole thing falls flat.
I agree. Yeah, I can't answer that. Because I have the same problem. Yeah, I can't answer that. And I haven't seen them answer that. So again, some of these quotes, most of these quotes are from evolutionists. And these are evolutionists. That's their field. Stephen Jay Gould, as a paleontologist, says, hey, this is a problem for us. Okay, so again, it takes a tremendous amount of faith. We have a video by a former member of ours, many of you know, Steve Boyle, who grew up as a Mormon, and when he went to university at Humboldt up north, he was an evolutionist, and at the time he pretty much would say he was an atheist. And he asked his professor, who he really liked, he said, so what is the evidence for evolution? Like, what's the best evidence for evolution? And the teacher said, there isn't any. We have to take it by faith. And that blew Steve Boyle's mind. I have an interview with him in our YouTube channel, a whole hour interview with his testimony. But he says for him, that was like, that opened the door to, okay, there's got to be a God, because this is not a satisfying answer. I have the science professor I respect and like the most tell me you got to take it by faith. I thought evolution was based on facts and science, and it's not. So that's the thing is when you go deep into an evolution textbook, whether it's biology, geology, if it's anything, their starting point, their presupposition is God cannot factor. The supernatural and God cannot factor into the equation. So we have to use our best guesses and go backward as what it could have been like or what it might have been like. But it's not based on facts. It's based on speculation and theories at best. So again, for me, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, and I don't have enough faith to be a naturalistic evolutionist either. It takes so much faith. I don't have that kind of faith. I, by nature, am a skeptic. That's why I'm a Christian. Now, that might sound weird to you, But the reason I'm a Christian is because there's so many facts and evidences that show me that Christianity is cogent, logical, true. And the more archaeology, the more artifacts that are discovered, the more names in the scriptures are substantiated, the more places are substantiated, the history of it all is substantiated. When you study science, you look at it and you go, wow, design, design, design. Thus the intelligent design movement. So you've got Jews and Muslims and agnostics that are becoming part of the intelligent design movement because they're studying their science and they're going, wow, there's no way this could happen by chance. This is design. But they're still being canceled by the scientific community. Yeah.
So I think the real shot between the eyes, I mean, if you go back, what, 100 years? What the big telescope, Hubble.
Uh-huh.
So even Einstein was struggling to support a constant theory that the universe is itself eternal.
Yeah.
And that's, so when you said earlier, there was a beginning, we think we can also arrive at that because it looks like there's going to be an end, It's like a fire goes out eventually.
Yeah.
And so if you go back before 1920, let's say, it was a fair argument to ask if there was even a beginning. And now apparently that has been established that there was a beginning.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, before,
different than it was
right,
beginning.
and before the Big Bang Theory, which basically was developed in the 1960s, I think it was an official, sort of an official proclamation that this is fact in about 1964. Most scientists today, way over 90% of scientists believe in the Big Bang Theory. But before that, the most widely held theory was the steady state theory.
Right.
And that was the most widely held theory. But there's there's over 10,000 scientists that aren't even Christians. They're just agnostics or whatever, who have signed a document that says we need to revisit the Big Bang Theory. Over 10,000 practicing scientists that doubt even in the Big Bang Theory and the problems that they have with it. So the reality is, again, if you don't start with God and you start with anything else and you're trying to prove it as a theory, of course it's not gonna hold water, because you're not starting with a foundational truth. You're actually starting with a foundational lie. So ultimately that's why evolution, and I'm glad to see that evolution has so many problems. And again, if you push any evolutionist backward, it doesn't matter how smart they are, and a lot of them are incredibly smart. But when you have Stephen Hawking, for instance, ultimately Stephen Hawking in his last book said that the universe came from nothing. He's considered one of the most brilliant was on the planet. And here's a guy making a nonsensical statement that probably some 4-year-olds can catch, Because what we learned early in logic is out of nothing comes nothing. And then the smartest, who many people consider the smartest in the world, says, heaven forbid, our starting point or our foundation is God. So our alternative is nothing. Yes?
So question about the mutation theory.
Uh-huh.
So to play the devil's advocate, I think what college student may say is that what's being pointed out here makes sense, but at the same time these mutations are not happening sequentially, but rather in parallel across different individuals in the population. So it may not actually take as much time as pointed out here.
Okay.
But of course it will still take time because it's genetic mutation, so that's why it takes billions of years.
Right.
What would be a possible critic for that?
Yeah. Anybody want to answer that? Yeah, Spencer.
Because I think I answered my own question, was right in that thing. They're saying that that mutations degenerate, they don't accelerate to more complex, they degenerate to less.
Yeah.
And the chances of it happening in an increasingly complex, beneficial way are more astronomical than
Yeah.
the other thing.
Yeah. Yeah, one guy I read he's not a Christian. He's a secular scientist, and I don't remember where I read this, but I read it this past week. But he said that in his study of mutations, and that's all he does, he studies mutations. He says 99% of them, it's like 99 point, I think he said 3% are detrimental. So, yeah, I mean, again, that takes a lot of faith to think that you got that 0.07% where we've come from. And so again, I would just say, yeah, they can argue the mutation thing all they want, but to me, that casts an incredible amount of doubt on my part that this can happen by mutations that typically are damaging. Yeah.
Spencer,
Yeah.
The other thing was that you'd have to get all the other
Right.
organs to
Right.
participate with it.
Yeah.
Rick, you go.
Yeah.
to address the direct question that you had, that they could happen in parallel. The biggest problem with that is that you have the beneficial mutations happening parallel to the non-beneficial. So the detriment of the non-beneficial to the beneficial would actually outweigh
By 99%.
the amount of time that would be accelerated by having bilateral mutations that were beneficial.
Oh, I see. When I say parallel, I think you're talking about within an individual. I'm talking about across different individuals. Like me.
No, I'm talking about different individuals. Like if you and I both had different mutations,
If Rick got a second head,
yeah, I mean,
detrimental.
the detrimental, because I'm still propagating the species as well,
Right.
in that case. So you have non-beneficial and beneficial both propagating the species.
Yes.
And so they kind of cancel each other out by 99% to the non-beneficial.
There was a two-headed frog. It didn't live. The benefit of having a two-headed frog was the frog could feed itself even better. But it couldn't. It died because it was a detriment to its life.
Yeah. Okay, good stuff. Let me close this in prayer, and we'll call this session a day.